Curious George learns to count from 1 to 100. This is George. George was a good little monkey and always very curious. This morning, George was curious about numbers. His friend, the man with the yellow hat, had been teaching him to count. Already, George could count to 5 on one hand and 10 on his 2 feet. "Good job, George," said his friend, "but you can count more than your fingers and toes. We're going to the centennial celebration today. It's our town's 100th birthday party, and I'll bet you can find enough things to count all the way to 100. 100 sounded like a lot to George. He was curious. Could he really find 100 things to count? First, George counted his bed. 1. Then he counted 2 blankets. He tossed his pillow and counted 1, 2, 3. He counted 4 legs on his bed and 5 full toys. What else could George count? Why, there was a lot of things in his toy box. 6 toy boats, 7 cars, 8 trucks, 9 stuffed animals, and 10 balls. George followed 1 bouncing ball into his friend's room. The man with the yellow hat was getting dressed. George wanted to dress up too. He saw 11 hats to choose from, 12 ties, 13 socks, and 14 shoes. In the bathroom, George's friend had just finished brushing his teeth. "I'm going to make breakfast, George," he said, but George was still busy counting. He counted 15 blue tiles, 16 rubber ducks, and 17 shower rings. It was fun to count upside down. Then George drew a surprise for his friend, 18 toothpaste pitchers. In the kitchen, George found more things to count. He stacked up 19 plates, 20 bowls, and 21 cups. He arranged 22 straws, 23 napkins, 24 spoons. Then George counted 25 blueberries. "Don't forget to count our pancakes," said the man. George counted while his friend flipped. 26. When George was full and his plate was empty, he was ready to count outside. In the backyard, George counted 27 clouds floating by and 28 apples on the tree. There were lots to do outside. George played with 29 bugs and gathered 30 acorns. He found 31 snails and arranged 32 sticks to create a design. Then George smelled the daisies and he picked 33. In his front yard, George counted 34 noisy birds and 35 leaves blowing in the air. There was something else in the air. A gust of wind scattered 36 letters with colorful stamps. George counted as he helped pick them up. "It's time to go to the centennial celebration, George," his friend said. "Do you remember how to walk to town? You can lead the way." George, curious as ever, took the long way from his house to town. As he walked, he counted 37 houses, 38 chimneys, and 38 trees. Can you follow George's path through the neighborhood? Here he goes. Woo! He went all around. In town, George and his friends saw workers fixing up the building. There was a very tall ladder, and George could not resist. He scampered up 40 rungs, past 41 windows. "What a view!" From on top of the ladder, George counted 42 people. One of them was his friend Betsy. "Hi, George," Betsy said when he climbed down to see her. "Your friend told me you were learning to count." Then George walked Betsy to her school. "Why don't you come inside?" she asked him. "There are lots of things to count in here." Betsy was right. There was plenty of things to count in her classroom, while George's friend talked to the teacher. George counted 43 sparkly beads, 44 jars of paste, and 45 crayons. On the table, 46 colorful feathers were laid out. George was curious. What are they for? Betsy's classmates were making hats and decorations for the centennial celebration. George wanted to make decorations too. In fact, he turned himself into a decoration. Then George's new friend cleaned off 47 colored strips of paper and a lot of glue. "George is counting all the way to 100, Betsy said. Susan said, "We can help. How many counting paper clips?" She and her sister, Sarah, helped George find 48. "There's lots of books on the shelf," said Jimmy. They counted 49. "And the states on the map," Henry added. He and George counted all 50. All the students had lots of ideas, and soon everyone was counting. "Look at the art," Betsy said. "We had made different things, but can count all the way our art together." 51. On the wall was the alphabet. Together they counted 52 letters, big and small. George was excited to find 53 colored pencils. These were even better than toothpaste for the drawing. "We aren't allowed to write on desks," the children told him, and they helped him clean up with 54 pink erasers. And then they took out lots of paper. And pretty soon, 55 paper airplanes were flying through the air. George chased one of the airplanes past the aquarium. Here was something to count. "Look at the goldfish." George counted 56. One of the airplanes landed on the cage. "We have a lot of class pets," Betsy told George, "and our mice just had babies." George couldn't wait to count them, but the mice would not keep still. It's hard to count them all in their cages. Carefully, George lifted the latch. There were 47 mice, and boy, were they speedy. When the mice were back in the cage, the teacher said, "I think it's time for us to go to the centennial celebration." "I think we should go now, too," the man said with the yellow hat. George waved goodbye to the children and counted 58 hands. A moment later, the bell rang and everyone was on the move. Then George counted 59 wheels. He wanted to ride, too. "You can borrow my bike, George," said Bill. Then George hopped on Bill's bike and pedaled away. While he rode, he counted 60 fence pickets and 61 dandelions. He blew 62 dandelion seeds. And along the river, George passed 63 ducks. 64 boats. He counted 65 flags and 66 bubbles floating in the air. George was so busy counting he forgot to watch where he was going and was surprised to look down the hill and see the centennial celebration in a park. There were 67 colorful picnic blankets, 68 striped tents, and 69 kites soaring through the breeze. George was excited to get closer. Seeing the picnics had made him hungry, and he was ready to go get something to eat. First, George visited the farmer's market. Vegetables were piled high. George counted 70 carrots, 71 peppers, 72 tomatoes, and 73 pumpkin seeds. The fruit looked as appealing as the vegetables and tasted as good, too. George counted 74 lemons, 75 bananas, 76 pears, and 77 grapes. He helped himself to some of each, and soon his tummy was full. George had eaten and counted so many things, but he had not yet counted all the way to 100. George was curious. What else could he count? And what was that sound coming down the street? It was a parade, and it was time for the centennial celebration to begin. George and his friends and neighbors had gathered to celebrate the 100th anniversary of their town. They were all lined up, clapping and cheering. George climbed the lamppost for a better view. What should he count first? As the parade marched by, George counted hats. There were 78. He counted pets. There were 79. And balloons, 80. George followed good smells to the picnic. If you were going on a picnic, what food would you pack? George discovered 81 sandwiches, 82 pickles, 83 potato chips, 84 pieces of popcorn, and 85 ants. There were a lot of tasty treats at the bake sale, and George had saved just enough room for dessert. What treat should he pick? There were 86 cupcakes, 87 slices of pie, and 88 cookies. While George ate just one of the cookies, he remembered what he wanted to see next. The games. George and Olivia took turns throwing balls at 89 holes. Bullseye! Olivia scored, and George helped her choose one of the 90 prizes. Swing, swing, pop. One of the games was a piñata. George arrived just in time. The paper pig broke and 91 candies spilled out. George helped himself to just a few. Then George went to help his neighbors, Mrs. Needleman. "Hello, George," she called from her flower cart. "Your friend told me you're trying to count to 100. Can you count my flowers for me? I've sold a lot today, but I think I have close to 100 left." Mrs. Needleman was right. George counted 92 flowers still in her cart. And then Mrs. Needleman had an idea. George asked, "Can you help me count the money I made today?" The centennial celebration was almost over, and Mrs. Needleman had to organize her money to bring it to the bank. Together they stacked 93 nickels, 94 quarters, 95 pennies, 96 dimes, and $97. Mrs. Needleman helped George count. He was even closer to 100, but he wasn't there yet. Mrs. Needleman pointed to where some children were playing. "Maybe they can help you reach 100, George," she said. Then she gave him a flower to thank him for his help. "Good luck, George." Some kids were playing sidewalk games, and Betsy was with them. "You've been counting all day, George," she said. "You must almost be to 100. George counted 98 marbles, 99 jacks, so he was close to 100. He only needed one more thing to count, but what would it be? And then George knew. George ran and ran. He ran 100 steps all the way back to the man in the yellow hat. His friend was so happy to see him. "You did it, George," his friend said proudly. "You used your own 2 feet to count all the way to 100. What a perfect way to end a centennial day." George was proud too, and after his first very full day, he was happy to be with his friend, the person he counted on the most. The end.